On a Monday afternoon in January 2022, a cruise ship called the Crystal Symphony was supposed to dock in Miami. It never made it. Instead, it changed course mid-voyage and ran for the Bahamas, trying to outrun a U.S. federal judge's order to seize it. Days later, authorities caught up with it anyway, arresting the ship in the waters near Freeport while only the crew remained aboard. The passengers were long gone. The company that owned it was already gone in every way that mattered. Shutting down a cruise line isn't like closing a restaurant. You can't just lock the gangway and walk away. There are ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars scattered across oceans, passengers who've already paid tens of thousands of dollars for cabins on voyages that no longer exist, crew members stuck on vessels with nowhere to go, and creditors circling before the ink on the bankruptcy filing is even dry. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a ship the size of a small city has to figure out where it's actually allowed to sail. The first thing that breaks is the money, and it breaks messily. Crystal Cruises, the line operating that ship in the Bahamas, was owned by a Hong Kong conglomerate called Genting Hong Kong, and when Genting collapsed under nearly $3 billion in debt, Crystal went down with it. The company's former president later admitted publicly that customers were owed more than $100 million in deposits and prepaid cruise fares. Some of that money belonged to passengers who'd paid with credit cards, which meant a chargeback was at least possible. But plenty of others had paid in cash, or had rebooked using future cruise credit from trips canceled earlier in the pandemic, and for them, the money was effectively just gone. The company's own former president described the moment plainly. They'd gone from a business valued at roughly $1 billion to a bank account sitting at zero in a matter of weeks. More than 20,000 booked passengers were affected by the shutdown, along with roughly 1,200 crew members still technically on the company's payroll. Genting Hong Kong itself had been unraveling for months before Crystal's collapse became public. Its German shipyard subsidiary, MV Werften, had already filed for bankruptcy weeks earlier, and within days of that filing, the company's chairman and CEO, Malaysian billionaire Lim Kok Thay, resigned and moved to formally wind the parent company down rather than risk what regulators call a disorderly liquidation, effectively an uncontrolled collapse with no plan for creditors at all. Then there's the specific detail almost nobody expects. The reason that ship was fleeing toward the Bahamas in the first place wasn't really about the passengers at all. It was about a fuel bill. A maritime fuel supplier called Peninsula Petroleum sued Crystal Cruises and its sister company Star Cruises over $4.6 million in unpaid fuel and asked a federal court to seize the ship itself as collateral. That's how maritime law tends to work. A ship isn't just a company asset sitting on a balance sheet. It's a physical thing creditors can chase down and physically detain wherever in the world it happens to be floating. Crystal Serenity, a sister ship, got refused permission to dock in Aruba entirely, and a third vessel, Crystal Endeavor, ended up effectively held in Argentina. 3 ships, 3 different countries, 3 separate legal standoffs, all within about 2 weeks of each other. It's a legal quirk most passengers never think about until it happens. Airlines can be sued and go bankrupt without a single plane ever being physically detained mid-flight. Ships don't get that luxury. Maritime law treats a vessel almost like a floating piece of real estate that creditors can arrest, literally the legal term used, in whatever port or territorial water it happens to be passing through. The crew caught in the middle of it had it worst of anyone in the short term. Officers and staff were still living aboard the seized ships in the Bahamas, technically employed by a company that had no functioning bank account. Crystal's statement at the time insisted crew were being paid everything owed and housed comfortably, some in actual guest staterooms. Whether or not that held up in practice, the basic image is hard to shake. A 5-star cruise ship, its casino and spa and dining rooms sitting completely empty, effectively impounded at a dock, with the people who used to serve 5-course dinners now just waiting to find out what happens to their jobs. It's a meaningfully different problem than what happens when an airline shuts down. Airline staff are almost always domestic employees who can walk into a competitor's hiring office the same week. Cruise ship crew are overwhelmingly foreign nationals, often from the Philippines, Indonesia, India, and Eastern Europe, working under contracts and visas tied specifically to that one employer and that one vessel. When the company collapses, many of them aren't just unemployed, they're stuck in a legal gray zone, needing repatriation flights home before they can even begin looking for their next contract with a different cruise line months later. If you're the kind of person who notices how quickly a company this size can go from $1 billion in value to a locked door, you're exactly who this channel is for. So what actually happens to the ships themselves? That part follows a pattern that repeats almost every time a cruise line collapses, and it's worth walking through, because the ships basically never just sit there rotting. Crystal's assets eventually got sold off through the bankruptcy process, and by 2023, a company called A&K Travel had bought the Crystal brand along with 2 of its ships, relaunching the line under new ownership with the same name and a mostly rebuilt identity. The Crystal Serenity and one of her sister ships got refurbished and put back into service. The brand didn't die. It got sold, stripped down to what still had resale value, and rebuilt by somebody else. That's actually the more common outcome than most people assume. Compare it to what happened to Pullmantur Cruises, a Spanish line jointly owned by Royal Caribbean and a private equity firm, which filed for insolvency in the summer of 2020 as the pandemic gutted the entire cruise industry overnight. Pullmantur operated 3 ships, all of them decades old, all originally built for Royal Caribbean or Celebrity Cruises before being handed down. Once the bankruptcy filing went through, crew still aboard the ships began stripping them for parts, pulling out equipment, furniture, and artwork for sale, which is usually the clearest signal that a company has quietly accepted the line itself isn't coming back, even if individual assets still have value. 2 of the 3 ships, the Monarch and the Sovereign, were eventually towed to a scrapyard in Turkey and broken apart entirely. The third, the Horizon, sat in limbo off the coast of Greece for close to 2 years before finally making its own final voyage to the same shipbreaking yards in 2022. With that, Pullmantur's entire fleet ceased to physically exist. The relaunch wasn't seamless, either. A&K Travel initially planned to bring back the full 3-ship fleet, but ultimately only 2 ships made it back into paying service, and the third, Crystal Endeavor, the expedition vessel that had been effectively stranded near Argentina during the original collapse, was sold off separately to a different operator entirely. The name survived. The company that built it did not, so there are really only 2 endings for a cruise ship once its parent company folds. Either it gets bought, refurbished, and reflagged into somebody else's fleet, the exact thing that happened with Crystal Serenity, or it gets towed to a breaking yard and reduced to raw steel, the exact thing that happened to the Sovereign and the Monarch. Which path a given ship takes usually comes down to one boring but decisive factor: age. Newer, larger, more efficient ships are worth saving and refitting. Older ships built in the 80s and early 90s are frequently worth more as scrap metal than as a functioning cruise ship, once you account for the cost of bringing them up to current safety and environmental standards. Renaissance Cruises offers the starkest version of the pattern going back further. The line collapsed in September of 2001, just days after the terrorist attacks in New York gutted international travel demand almost overnight, stranding passengers on multiple ships mid-voyage with effectively no notice. Its fleet of 8 ships eventually got scattered across half a dozen different buyers over the following years, some resold into other cruise brands entirely, a few eventually scrapped once their resale value ran out. 2 decades later, the exact same playbook played out with Crystal, just with sharper legal drama and a much bigger camera pointed at it thanks to social media. Passengers, meanwhile, are dealing with an entirely separate kind of chaos, one that depends heavily on how they paid. Credit card payments are protected under chargeback rules in most countries, which is why cruise lines and travel advisors constantly push customers toward paying that way rather than by wire transfer or check. Deposits paid directly or through smaller booking agents tend to disappear into the same unsecured creditor pool as everyone else the company owes money to: employees, fuel suppliers, port authorities, all fighting over whatever assets are actually left once the lawyers finish sorting through what's real and what's already spoken for. Travel agents get hit from a different angle entirely. Independent agents who'd booked clients on Crystal voyages were often owed commissions going back months, sometimes on cruises that had already sailed and been paid for in full, and those commission claims land in the exact same unsecured creditor line as everyone else's. Travel insurance, the kind specifically covering supplier default, is really the only reliable way to get made whole in a scenario like this, and industry data consistently shows only a small minority of cruise passengers actually buy a policy that covers it, usually because the risk feels abstract right up until it isn't. There's a ripple effect that reaches well past the passengers and crew, too. Ports that depended on a collapsed line for regular calls lose that tourism revenue instantly, with no transition period to plan around. Destinations that had built shore excursion businesses, tour operators, taxi networks, entire small tourism economies around a predictable cruise schedule are often the last to hear anything is wrong, finding out only when a ship that was supposed to arrive simply never shows up. Unlike a major airline collapse, where competitors frequently rush in days to grab abandoned routes, cruise capacity moves much slower, because building or repositioning a ship takes years of lead time that a nervous industry isn't eager to commit right after watching a competitor implode. Some of those local businesses never fully recover the volume a major cruise line once brought them, especially in smaller ports that had built an entire local economy around 1 or 2 predictable ship visits a week. And underneath all of that sits a bigger, quieter problem, one that plays out identically almost every time this happens across the entire travel industry. When a mid-sized operator disappears, competitors don't rush in to fill the gap nearly as fast as you'd expect. In the cruise industry, especially with river cruise lines and smaller luxury operators, capacity that disappears in a bankruptcy filing often just stays gone for years because building or acquiring a new ship takes enormous capital and lead time that a spooked, cautious industry isn't eager to commit right after watching a competitor collapse. There's a structural reason luxury and ultra-luxury cruise lines seem to collapse more visibly than mainstream ones, too. A ship like Crystal Symphony carries under 1,000 passengers paying premium fares, compared to the 6,000 or 7,000 a mainstream megaship carries at a fraction of the per-cabin price. That math means fixed costs, fuel, crew salaries, port fees, insurance, stay roughly the same regardless of how luxurious the experience is, but the revenue cushion protecting against a bad year is dramatically thinner. A mainstream line can absorb a rough quarter by discounting fares and filling cabins. A luxury line with half-empty ships and no room to cut prices without damaging the brand has far less room to maneuver before the math simply stops working. Crystal wasn't the first line to disappear this way, and it won't be the last either. Renaissance Cruises collapsed in 2001 after the September 11th attacks gutted international travel demand almost overnight. Premier Cruise Lines folded in 2000. Debonair, Regency, American Classic Voyages, all gone at various points over the past few decades, each one taking a slightly different route to the same ending. The pattern underneath nearly every collapse looks remarkably similar. A line takes on debt to expand or survive a downturn, gets squeezed by rising fuel and labor costs, it can't pass fully onto ticket prices, and eventually runs out of cash faster than revenue can rebuild. Crystal's version had a few extra layers: a parent company juggling a failing German shipyard, a pandemic that had already gutted 2 full years of bookings, and finally a fuel bill lawsuit that became the technical trigger for the whole public collapse. But the underlying arithmetic was the same one that's ended dozens of cruise lines before it. Here's the part that matters most once the dust actually settles. A cruise line disappearing looks, from the outside, like a single dramatic event: ships fleeing federal marshals, a company's bank account hitting zero overnight, headlines about stranded passengers and impounded ships. But underneath, it's closer to a slow-motion disassembly than a sudden death. The ships get sold or scrapped. The brand name sometimes gets bought and relaunched by somebody with fresh capital and none of the old debt. The routes and ports get picked up, eventually, by whichever competitors decide the math still works. And the people who actually built the company, the crew who lived aboard those ships for months at a time, the passengers who trusted a name they'd cruised with for years, are the ones left picking up the pieces of something that, on paper, simply stopped existing. A cruise line doesn't really die the way a business is supposed to. It gets taken apart, piece by everyone who still owed something when the money finally runs out. If a company can vanish that fast with billions in assets still technically afloat, the next question is what happens when a single ship is pushed to do something it was never built for. Next time, we're looking at the world's longest cruise voyage, a 274-night trip around the entire planet on a 20-year-old ship that, by most normal standards, should never have made it through the Drake Passage in one piece. Subscribe to see exactly how close it came to not